Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I'm doing my historical figures video. In this video I'm going to talk about William Bradford, who was the leader on the Mayflower in 1619 to 20 because it takes a little bit of time to get over the Atlantic in a boat those days. He was born in York, UK in 1589 on March 19th. Last spring I was a research assistant for one of my professors and I absolutely loved it. She is related to basically the troublemaker on the Mayflower when it came over in 1620. And so for the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower Compact, which will happen in 2020, she is writing an article that may turn into a book about the Mayflower Compact and its impact on our Constitution and our government. That is right up my alley as far as research, so I spent many hours researching for her. And in honor of this video, I'm going to talk about several of those books. I only have one or two books that are specifically related to William Bradford. One of them, which is, I guess, the first one we'll start with, is of Plymouth Plantation, which is actually written by William Bradford about his experience sailing over to Plymouth, founding the settlement, how they survived, and then all the way up through several years later. First of all, I did enjoy this book, even if it was for a research project. It is definitely written in the 17th century English. However, once you sort of get into the flow of it, like any of the older English, it's actually fairly easy to read. It was also highly entertaining to me because there are a couple stories throughout. For example, my professor's relatives apparently almost blew up the ship by accidentally firing a gun in the powder room. They didn't blow up the ship, but that was an interesting story, and then later I learned that was who she was related to. I liked that. I also liked learning about the founding of Massachusetts, basically, through the eyes of somebody who was actually there. The next book is one that was written several years later by Edward Winslow, following the same events, and it's called Morts Relation. This one, like I said, follows the same sort of events of the Mayflower landing and all those fun little quirky stories, and also the religious part of it was huge in both of these books because they were Puritans. That was a very big reason as to why they were emigrating to the New World. Both these books, like I said, are written in fairly archaic English, but if you don't mind working through the first 50 pages or so, it gets much easier once you get into the habit. I also read Magnolia, Christie, Americana, which may not be pronounced correctly because that's in Latin, but that was written by Cotton Mather, and it was similarly also about the Mayflower, but more about the religious aspect. Cotton Mather and his family are big Puritan preachers in Massachusetts for quite a while, so this was interesting to read, just his take on it and the religious aspect, because despite the fact that our state and our religion are supposed to be separated, they have had quite an impact on each other over the centuries. I also enjoyed this book, not quite as much because Cotton Mather is a bit out there. He's really stringent, extraordinarily puritanical. Fits his occupation, but it was interesting to read that. I also read The Origins of the American Constitution by Donald Lutz. Donald Lutz is a big scholar in that area, and that book was actually unbelievably helpful in finding a lot of the connections between the Mayflower Compact and our Constitution. I also had to read several state constitutions, namely Massachusetts. We went through several of them, but to figure out where all these links are. Unsurprisingly, there's more than you would think, but the Donald Lutz book was probably one of my favorites that I read, simply because it's written in modern English and it's laid out so nice and formulaically that you could really see how the history affected us today. One I didn't quite get through because it is quite the chunker of a book is American Political Writings During the Founding Era, 1760 to 1805 by Charles Heinemann and Donald Lutz. I bought a copy of this for myself because I wanted to read it afterwards. This one is what the title says. It's a lot of the political writings from the beginning of our nation. And I just find that really interesting. I have the Federalist Papers somewhere in all of my mess that I really want to get to as well, which has nothing to do with this, but I just really enjoy reading about what their ideas were and seeing how they are applicable and connected to today. And then more related to just the history of York, which is where William Bradford was born, I have Wars of the Roses by Dan Jones. Basically anything related to the Wars of the Roses or the Plantagenets is relevant here, but I chose to include this one because I've read it and it's a little bit more related to York, simply because there are many, many Dukes of York, and one of the Dukes of York is one of the reasons for the Wars of the Roses. He's one of those who decided he was going to fight against the current king, and so they have all these big battles and hundreds of people die. It's a whole big mess. But this book does a really good job of explaining what the Wars of the Roses are, why they happened, how they happened, and basically sort of guiding you into what the next period of time is, which is the Tudors. And speaking of the Tudors, the last book I have is The Burning Time, which I recently finished, by Virginia Rounding. This book is Mary Tudor and Henry VIII's religious beliefs from about 1528 to 1558, when Elizabeth takes the throne. There is one chapter on Edward VI, but there were only 2 burnings in his time, which I did not realize, so it really only needs to be 1 chapter. He wasn't quite as fanatical about burning heretics as the others. I include this book not because it has anything to do with York specifically, or even William Bradford, but mostly because it really helps to flesh out the religious aspects of the time period. Like I said, this is 1528 to 1558, and that time period is unbelievably chaotic for anybody even remotely vested in religion. There are people who get their livings as a deacon or what have you under Henry when he's married to Anne Boleyn, and then within 3 years they lose their livings and possibly their heads because he's Catholic again with Jane Seymour. And vice versa through the last 10 years or so of his reign, and then they have 5 years of relative stability with Edward VI, and then Mary comes and all hell breaks loose because you cannot be a Protestant if you want to survive her reign. I clearly really enjoyed this book. It was really interesting, and like I said, it just really sort of delves into a lot of the more religious factors of the time period and helped me understand a lot of the things I read last spring about the Puritans and everything like that, because last spring I didn't have as much of an understanding about their religious beliefs. I knew vaguely what it was, but my understanding of the schism was there's Protestants and there's Catholics. That's all I had. And this book really helped to figure out what some of those different sects of Protestantism were and why people like William Bradford broke away. Those are all of the books I have to talk about William Bradford and his birth in 1589. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up. If you want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button down below. As always, I will leave my Goodreads in the down bar if you want to check out what I read. But until my next video, bye!